Good evening. Welcome to Genomics for Women, Genes, Hormones, and the Female Body. We have a wonderful guest tonight. While I'm giving you the introduction, I would like to encourage you to fill out our poll questions because that helps us to help you. And if you have your gene reports, go ahead and get those out or take a look at the app, it's really easy to switch back and forth between various reports while we're talking. So have those handy for yourselves this evening. Um, did you know that until the 1990s, women of childbearing age were excluded from most clinical trials? Even today, women make up only about 41% of trial participants, despite being over half of the population. As a result, medicine has often applied a one-size-fits-all male standard, overlooking crucial genetic and hormonal differences in women. And we are fortunate to be alive in a time where things like that are changing, where there's more research being done with women, and where we have genomics. So with me this evening is Dr. Betty Murray, who has years of experience working with women's hormones and metabolism. She is the owner of Minerva Telemedicine, so she can help women in all 50 states with their hormones. Welcome, Dr. Murray. I'm so happy to have you here this evening.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Hardcastle. I'm happy to be here.
So I think that one of the issues with, the more male-centered medicine is how many women have been misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, told that what they really needed was an antidepressant or therapy or something like that, et cetera. What are your thoughts about that, Dr. Murray?
Oh my gosh, that gets me fired up. I think most people would be flabbergasted to know that women were intentionally left out of studies until 1993. We had to federally mandate the inclusion of women in medical studies examining particularly the use of medications to treat diseases. So if you think about that, think about how many generic drugs actually exist that are our primary prescribing drugs, right? Especially Medicare, right? Those are the cheaper drugs. Those drugs, many of which were never actually clinically trialed in women to identify if women have a different metabolic effect with those medications than men. And actually, there's only one drug on the planet that has a female-centric dose, right? And that is, oh my God, now I just had a menopausal moment. Love of God. The sleep medication, the
Ambien?
Ambien. Yeah, Ambien. And the reason why, so they start women at a lower dose, half the dose of men, was only because of a lawsuit, because because a lot of people disassociate, they eat, sleep, walk, sleep, drive. This woman had whatever was going on. She killed her husband in his sleep and doesn't remember any of it, right? She had a psychotic kind of event in a sleep-like state from that drug. And because of the lawsuit, they created a separate dosing schedule for women, but no other drugs are female-centric, right?
That's really something.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that sometimes women have different symptoms of things, cardiovascular issues being one of them. That a lot of times they're milder symptoms or show up and people think that they're GI or anxiety related. And so a lot of women are having these things under considered by their physicians, and they're less likely to have testing done if they come in with a complaint. So I think up to 50% are more likely to be misdiagnosed than a man, and that's really
We're more
crazy
likely to die. We are literally more likely to die while in the ER with a heart attack than a man because we present so differently, right? Our heart attacks are more likely to be fatal than a man.
But calling them atypical symptoms when women are 50 to 51% of the population seems like that's not really accurately describing the situation.
Now that's atypical to patriarchal medicine, but yes, typical for a woman. So for a lot of times for a woman, as heart disease or heart attack, as an example, will get nausea, fatigue. I will say also what we hear clinically is this vague sense of doom, right? Like terribly fatigued, some nausea, some just overall feeling bad, right? So how many women wake up like that on a regular basis? And it's not a heart attack, but that's just kind of part of our existence, particularly probably close to our period. right? So we don't know our own symptoms because we don't get the chest clutching, shooting pain down my, left arm and jaw pain and all that. We don't generally see that. And so we don't get help soon enough. And then when we do go to a hospital, we get gaslit and told that it's anxiety.
It's really super wild. And autoimmune conditions are also more prevalent in women.
Mm-hmm.
And those things are underexplored in general, especially in terms of genetics. But we're starting to do that now, right? We're able to help people with their autoimmune symptoms by knowing what their genetics are. We help them with their symptoms and with managing things a lot better. But 85% or more of patients with multiple autoimmune diseases are female.
Yep.
And I don't think that there's any accident that there are also these turning points where they tend to arise for women, although they can arise at any time. But Dr. Murray, what do you think about a hormonal connection to autoimmune disease? Do you see a connection there?
Oh, there's absolutely. I mean, nature doesn't lie, and you can't overlook what's logical. So if it's a 10-to-1 female to male problem, there's a significant impact that hormones have, and especially high variability times of hormones like puberty onset. That's where we see a lot. Then we see a lot around pregnancy and postpartum. And then we also see an uptick in perimenopause and menopause. And I think one of the big things, just if we look at the very simplistic view, estrogen is immune modulating. When estrogen is balanced, it supports a normal functioning immune system. When it's radically high, we get inflammatory. And when it's radically low, we get inflammatory. And the regulatory capacity goes sideways. And so, we have to see that progesterone is immune stabilizing. Testosterone is immune stabilizing. But of course, we don't carry nearly the same amount as men. And so while autoimmunity can affect both parties, it is definitely predominantly female.
Absolutely. So I just want to bring up one other little statistic thing before we get to our poll
Yeah.
questions, which is that women's health has been historically underfunded, with as little as 5% of healthcare research being allocated to female specific conditions. And when we look at the statistics of how many women can be affected by some of these conditions and how little funding was done around those versus some things that pretty much specifically happen to men, although sometimes now they're using those medications for women, but I'm getting off topic here. Endometriosis, which affects at least 1 in 10 women, and roughly the same number of men suffer from erectile dysfunction. And think about the difference in the funding historically that's been done between those two conditions. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it was 2022. It was astronomical, the difference. So the reality is we have multiple medications for erectile dysfunction. We have outspent endometriosis research at orders of magnitude to find an answer for erectile dysfunction. Definitely a demoralizing condition, but endometriosis not only affects a woman's overall reproductive life, their entire life, it affects their fertility. It affects their health overall. I mean, we're starting to understand there's more inflammatory activity, just cross-body inflammatory activity, more likelihood for autoimmune activity if you have endometriosis. It causes infertility. It's not necessarily always in all cases. So it's not just something that is ruins a little bit a part of your life or is demoralizing. This is debilitating, and it gets almost no research. And then if I can add to that statistic, menopause, which 100% of women go through, right? No pass on that. And we spend at least a third of our life in it, gets 1% of research dollars. And the active aging in menopause accelerates your risk for all-cause mortality. So everything we can die from gets accelerated when we're through menopause, but we don't bother studying it. So if you're a lady, you should be mad.
Absolutely. And be seeking support and help from people who are willing and able to support and help you through
Yeah.
that. All right, Vanny, I'd love to take a look at the poll questions so that we can see who's in our audience and what they're interested in this evening. All right, our first question is, do you feel women's health has been underrepresented in medical research? 68% say yes, definitely. 26% say somewhat, but progress is being made. And 5% say not really sure. And 1% no, I think it's well represented. So most of you were unsurprised by what Dr. Murray and I were sharing. Number 2, which area of women's health are you most interested in? 60% hormones and metabolism, 21% menopause, 1% fertility and reproductive health, 9% breast health and cancer prevention, and 9% stress and mental health. Number 3, how familiar are you with the idea that genes and lifestyle interact to shape women's health? 45% said very familiar, I already apply this knowledge. 47% said somewhat familiar, I've heard about it but not applied it. 6% said not very familiar, this is new to me, and 1% said not sure. Number 4, which area of your health feels hardest to manage? So 35% said weight and metabolism, 26% said sleep and stress, 18% said hormones and mood, 12% said menopause symptoms, 9% said other and added it to the chat, and we'll take a look at those. And number 5, what would you most like to gain from this session? 43% said actionable strategies to balance hormones. 18% said better understanding of menopause and genomics. Another 18% said insight into nutrition and personalized wellness. And 12% said new tools for prevention and early detection. And 8% inspiration and motivation to take control of my health. Well, Dr. Murray is definitely going to inspire you to do that, and I will do my part as well. So thank you all for filling out our poll. It does help us to help you. So, Dr. Murray,
Yes.
you have been incorporating genetics into your practice and into your helping of women for a long time. I think you were mentioning that when we were in our pre-meeting meeting. Let's talk about some of the ways that genes can empower us to help our our hormones at any age, perhaps specifically in some of the age ranges that were mentioned in the poll questions, like menopause and things like that, in terms of metabolism, in terms of health and sleep and mood and all of those things.
Yeah, so I always think of the genetics as, we tend to, actually, let me back up and say this. We tend to view, like when we're looking at genetics, like I got into genetics because I'm adopted. I didn't have any way to understand my risk profile for things by looking, because I didn't have anybody I could look at. And so I started doing genetics. I did SNP testing. I've done entire whole genome sequencing. I've done it all. And what I have found over time is the first thing is, a lot of times we view genetics as, if it's a SNP, if it's a mutation, that it's bad, right? So many of you might be on this and like, I have this SNP, it's bad. Well, it's way more nuanced than that. There's not necessarily a good gene or a bad gene. There's some that derive better or create better function in particular enzyme pathways than others. But it's important to recognize that these gene patterns appeared, and the variations we see appeared because our ancestors had environmental pressures that caused those gene changes that allowed them to survive. Right. So every gene, like MTHFR gene, everybody's heard about that gene and they're all like, oh my gosh, I have the MTHFR gene. And I'm like, well, we got to remember that that gene has a penetration in Caucasian community by about 49%, Hispanic about 47%, African American, roughly the same. So it has this enormous penetration, right? So if it was so bad, it would have been bred out of the gene pool a long time ago, right? What makes it bad is not the gene, it's the epigenetics. It's the environment in which we are in today, right? So the first thing I always think about is our genes were wired to protect us based on the experiences of our ancestors, so we could get to this point, right? So our species could continue. And where we become disconnected is when our genes are designed to handle a certain environment and we give them a new environment. Right? So I'm going to give an example. I'm going to use this example repeatedly as we talk about things. So your genes are like a concrete foundation, right? So if you've ever built a house and you walk up to the foundation, when they pour it, you can tell how deep it is and how wide. You might be able to tell where the plumbing is. You can't really tell what the house is going to look like at all. right? That's your genetics. That gives you your parameters, right? Your hard parameters. Now, you could build a single story ranch, you could build a 2-story colonial, or you could build a 3-story condo complex with a pool on top that throws a party every Friday night, right? Now, if your genetics, your blueprint was designed to really handle a ranch style home because you didn't have a bunch of toxicity in your ancestors' lives and they were maybe a little more organic than the others and cleaner environment, and you throw a 3-story condo complex with a pool and a party every weekend, you're going to crack your foundation, right? So when we look at the things that affect our health, right? Weight gain, metabolism, symptoms of hormone disruption. What that really is, in many cases, is a mismatch between how you're wired, right? And what environmental inputs are getting put in, many of which you have control of, and how to bring equilibrium there. So it's not necessarily always good or bad. Yes, if I'm going to show my genes later because I always joke about doing this. So I'm like, I'm throwing it up there. But yeah, I have a whole bunch of SNPs in the glutathione pathway, right? That's not great. But if I lived really, really clean and let's say, I'm probably okay. But if I smoked and drank like Keith Richards and did a bunch of drugs, that probably wouldn't be my best avenue. And so what's really important is it's largely available for you to change. And the other big thing about these genes, particularly when we talk about women's health, is these act in pathways. There's a bunch of pathways. So it's never a gene in isolation, right? One little gene might be somewhat impactful, but not really, but it's the combination of those genes. And particularly when you're in your, like, let's say 40s and 50s, when we're in that perimenopause and menopausal state, we have a lot of activation that's happening because we have ovarian failure happening, right? We're running out of eggs in the egg carton. And so for some of the period, we've got massive stimulation to the estrogen pathway where there's excess because your estrogen's on a bungee cord. And so today it's high, tomorrow it's low. It's high for 5 days and then it goes lower. Progesterone's really low. So estrogen's high relative to it. So you start to see this sort of backup of these pathways that start to show mood issues, acne. Like I remember perimenopause started for me. I got the chin acne all of a sudden here. It looked like I was playing band. I remember that from like band, you had the little chin strap. I was like, I had this massive acne brow outbreak that was worse than when I was a teenager. Right. And it was those hormones starting to shift. And it's not just about the hormones you make, it's about, or the hormones you take, it's about the ones you can excrete, right? And whether you get them to the dumpster. So the other part of that too is your hormones don't operate in isolation. So specifically around metabolism, which I know is the primary part of this conversation or a big part of this conversation today, we have to remember that estrogen doesn't just act in your breast, ovaries, and uterus. Every single cell but 2 in the body have estrogen receptors, red blood cells and a single type of cell in the brain. So every single cell feels estrogens change. And when we see that change, it affects everything from your cell's ability to burn fat, like actually even mobilize it, right? To the powerhouse mitochondria inside your cell functioning, all the way to how you detox and the impact of those toxins, being stored in the fat and everything else. And so I think it's understanding that the genes aren't the damaging part. It's the stuff that we can change that we can change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said. There was a study that we were looking at, and it was very interesting because the first thing that the study showed, and if all of you have your reports out, this will make more sense to you, that women with lower CYP3A4 activity, so those were the AAs, they have a decreased metabolism into the 16-OH pathway, and also higher COMT activity, these were the GGs, they have fast COMPs, initially appeared to have lower symptoms of menopause in terms of like hot flashes and night sweats and things like that. But then they had to adjust the data for the use of hormone therapy. And, this really speaks to that's an input that we're giving the body, right? That's a choice that people are making. I'm going to use hormone replacement therapy, and it made a huge difference. And it actually made it so that there was not a significant difference in this study. But if someone had different genetics, they might have a different kind of response to hormone therapy if they don't know what their genes are. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't use it, but that they have to understand how their specific body works in order to feel good doing it. And Dr. Murray, I think that you are a perfect example of this because I believe that you use hormone replacement therapy,
I
and
do.
some of your genes are what we would call suboptimal. But look at you. You're
Yeah.
happy, healthy, you look great, you know. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to share because I always joke about sharing my hormone pathway genetic picture just because it sometimes is helpful. And I've done this as a podcast, so I shared my entire review of my hormones on a podcast. So my stuff is an open book, And so in most cases, if you were to look particularly, not so much even at my step 1, but if you look at my step 2, so your CYP or CYP enzyme pathways, I have a high risk for estrogen toxicity. My ability to just basically get it. I always think of this as here's my analogy for detoxification. So I'll give a little bit of story. When I first got through biochemistry and I was learning about biotransformation and CYP enzymes, my simplified mind was like, I thought of it as, hey, I broke this chair. I need to shove the chair in a trash can. I can't fit it, so I need to break the other legs off of it. That it was this action of breaking down. That's actually not how biotransformation happens. It's actually almost like a adding to, right? So essentially you've got the CYP enzymes that utilize B vitamins and amino acids. And I like to think of it as a different colored tissue paper, right? So like the CYP1A1 going to 2-hydroxy is a green tissue paper. I want a lot of that. So 3 little bears. And the CYP1B1 is the red tissue. Don't want a lot of that. And then the CYP3A4 is blue. Not great, not awesome, right? Not terrible either. And that they have to go in order, right? And so if you look at mine, right, I've got estrogen toxicity. I'm not good at clearance, right? I'm not good at even that first wrapper activity. I'm slow to convert to 2-hydroxy, pretty good at 1B1 and not really great at 3A4. And then, but if you look at my step 3, my ability to take that and conjugate it, right? So take another wrapper and wrap around it, because I have to do that before I can even get it close to the dumpster, right? So I have to get it to the dumpster. I'm not good at any one of those, right? So what that means is environmentally, when I went into perimenopause, right? Up until that point, I was on the pill. I felt terrible on the pill. I'll just give that as an example. I felt terrible on the pill. I was in the study that approved Zoloft for the treatment of PMDD. And it never even occurred to me that the mood stuff that I was experiencing was because I was on the pill. I thought it was me, right? I didn't know any better. I was young, right? And this now kind of explains it. I'm like, oh, probably wasn't doing very good clearing that. But when I went in my 40s is when I really experienced all of the stuff. And the biggest thing I experienced quickly was weight gain, doing the exact same things. I'd been a bodybuilder, and a lot of it, I believe, is in these 2 steps of pathways, right? It's the inability to clear it and eliminate estrogens and do this last step. And it's more so environmental, but I'm on hormones, right? So I'm on hormones because now that I know my genes, I know how to manipulate these nutritionally. And I think that's the most important thing, is these don't exclude you from being able to do things like hormone replacement. It's just very vital that you work with somebody that's going to look at these pathways, even without genetics. Like we have people that come to our team, our medical team, because I don't see patients. I have prescribers that see patients all across the US. We may not have their genetics, but we can see this in action by looking in urine, right? We can look at these metabolites. So we can literally say, I made a modification to what I'm doing. Is it getting out or not? And I think that's important because just because you have crappy genetics doesn't mean that you can't do hormone replacement or support yourself in some way. It's just you got to understand where to go. So when we look at the genes, do you want me to talk mostly, Dr. Steady Hardcastle, about kind of the metabolic effects? Do you want me to focus on that first, kind of what happens metabolically?
I think that's a good place to start, and then we'll get into examples of the kinds of lifestyle inputs that you can put in order to make a change in this area without, we're still not going to be giving anyone
I'm
specific
not individual,
advice.
I'm speaking generalities.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple key things. So I'm going to talk in big picture first, right? So our fat cells Our fat cells exhibit the aromatase enzyme, right? So they use the same gene, same enzyme, and it actually converts testosterone into estrogen, right? It's making estrone though. So your fat cells make estrone, right? Now, when you get to perimenopause, we get progesterone's declining. So relative to estrogen, progesterone is low, estrogen is high relative to it, even if you don't have crazy high levels. So we often end up in a de facto estrogen dominant state. So the other part of that is estrogen will increase insulin resistance. So if I have a dietary thing where I'm not sleeping well, I don't, my insulin control isn't great, maybe I, do shift work, or maybe my diet isn't super dialed in, I'm going to have some insulin resistance where my body is not as sensitive to it. So it keeps having to get higher and higher to actually push glucose across the cell wall. And then if I'm somewhat sedentary, I'm not able to burn glucose very well because our muscle tissue are our primary kind of engines to burn fat, right? So we need to move, and we are often fatigued, so we don't feel like moving. And so when that estrogen is high, we get this sort of self-fulfilling loop where we become more insulin resistant. Estrogen is still high, we get more insulin resistance. And oh, by the way, testosterone is getting converted to estrogen in the fat cells. And then the fat is also where we store toxins that we cannot metabolize from the liver. So if I have slowing of those detox pathways, the body goes, I don't know what to do with that. I'm going to shove it in the fat cell, right? So that's what starts to happen, right? So that's what starts to happen in perimenopause. So we often see that sort of occur. Now, as we head into menopause, there's a whole bunch of other things that starts to happen. And this starts all the way down inside the cell. So our mitochondria have estrogen receptors. So those are your powerhouses. So they are responsible for making energy, ATP, burning fat, burning sugar. Well, they are estrogen dependent, and we see a downregulation of ATP production as estrogen starts to decline, right? The other thing is there's a transporter. So once insulin pushes glucose across the cell wall, there's a transporter called GLUT4. So think of GLUT4 as kind of a passive transport. So I like to think of it, I could have a slide that's really tilted and the glucose goes really quickly to the powerhouse, or it's got a mild tilt. So GLUT4 is a mild tilt, but it's also estrogen dependent. So we see dysregulation of the ability to get glucose to the powerhouse. And so you get glucose basically trapped outside the powerhouse, not actually working. We become more insulin resistant. The mitochondria are running slower. So you get hypometabolic, right? So the cell itself becomes hypometabolic, slower. And that's why we see weight gain. On top of that, the loss of estrogen drives inflammatory response, and that insulin resistance is still there. So we get more visceral fat deposit. That's where the widening of the waistline, like every woman's like, I used to have a waistline and now I have a muffin top, right? They're like, what happened? Right. And we build up fat around underneath the muscle around the vital organs. And so then we get more inflammation, more cytokine, this sort of self-fulfilling sort of prophecy, right? When we look at the detoxification pathways, if I have problems with like CYP1B1 or CY3A4 or my methylation SOD2, glutathione, COMT, any of those aren't working very well, if our body cannot get that stuff to the trash, it's going to then take those and shove those byproducts, 4-hydroxy, 16-hydroxy, sulfated estrogen, all of those things, it's going to shove into the fat cells as storage because the body says, look, that's our deep storage away from the important organs. We're going to leave it there. And it becomes harder to burn fat. So when you talk to trainers and they're like, you just need to exercise more and eat more lean protein, we already know statistically in the research that doesn't do it for women. So if somebody tells you that, you smack them twice and tell them to go away because it's not true, right? It's not true. It's not calories in, calories out, not when you're in perimenopause and menopause. There is some degree of you got to have a deficit, but it's hard to create a deficit when everything's on the slow-mo.
Thank you. That was amazing. So, what kinds of things can people do in order to make this switch, to feel better, to get their metabolism back on track, to you know to decide whether or not they're on the right level of HRT? I mean, testing obviously, but are there symptoms that they would be looking for if they might need it or they might need a different dosage? So those are, I know that was like 4 questions. So
like different dosage for hormones or whatever. So when you're looking at hormone replacement, right? So there's a big gap, obviously, in the research. It's actually why Minerva exists. We're actually building the first digital health intelligence platform to basically collapse this gap. We'll have the largest longitudinal database of women's health. Finally got an investment for that. So it's coming. It's coming, ladies. I promise it's coming. So when we're looking at hormone replacement, the dose, like the dose your friend's on or whatever, doesn't make a difference to you, right? There's very little research in this, but Louise Newsom out of England did a study looking at the standardized doses that they have in England, who's actually ahead of the US, mind you, on menopausal care. And what she found in her patient population, if you followed the recommended dose, 50% would be underdosed, 25% would be overdosed, right? There's a lot of variability. Some of that is, again, those genetic pathways and how you use it and how you get rid of it. Gut health can make a difference. So when we're looking at hormone replacement, the first thing we're always looking for is, are we seeing some resolution of symptoms? So I would love it if taking estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone would automatically cause weight loss. But here's the insidious part of that. It doesn't. All that metabolic stuff that happened, that sort of occurred, hormones help set up the environment for it to work, but you have to do stuff, and we're going to cover that. Right. So the hormones help. But the first thing we're looking for is, generally speaking, the symptoms that we can put our finger on, are they improving? Right. Conventional medicine says, look for symptom improvement. If you're not hot flashing, you're fine, which again, 50% are going to be underdosed, 25% will be overdosed. I've never had a hot flash. I had plenty of other ones that just never had one of those. I don't know. And I've been in menopause for at least 8 years. Right. So we're looking for symptoms resolution, palpitations, mood swings, sleep, anxiety, depression, hot flashes, night sweats, joint pain, tinkle when you sneeze, all of those things, whatever those are, we're starting to look for those to improve. When we're looking at lab values, we look at 2 different areas of lab values. To know we've got effective dose, we check the blood. Now, blood is not the most ideal place to check hormones. Hormones have taxicab drivers, sex hormone binding globulin. And when you look in blood, you can't tell how many got out of the hormone and got free and how many are stuck, right? So you can't tell. So you can kind of guesstimate, but we don't know. However, that's what the studies were used to show, that we get bone health benefit, cognitive benefit. And to be honest, that the replacement range for like a menopausal woman is about a 50 to an 80 on an estradiol. Some women, to feel better, maybe slightly higher than that, but we start to see those protective mechanisms in women in that 50 to 80 range. And progesterone needs to be, I would say, 15% of that most of the time, somewhere a little higher than that, just to get sleep effectiveness. And then testosterone usually around 80. Some people dose higher. I'm sure you see that, Dr. Hardcastle. Some people dose lower. I would say that depends a lot on androgen receptors and androgen clearance and moving it to estrogen. So let's say somebody's got that, or maybe they're a perimenopausal woman, because there's quite a few women, it looks like, that may not be fully through menopause. In a lot of cases, if you're in that sort of early window, it might just be progesterone that you need, right? Progesterone is the one that's declining first, right? And usually we see sleep interruption and those kind of things. So once you have that, then we look at urinary hormones, right? So that's the Dutch test, the HUMAP, the hormone zoomer. Rhine Labs has one, but it looks at those genetic pathways in motion. So we can actually see exactly what your genes are doing. And we can manipulate it with the right nutrients to either push, towards 2-hydroxy pathway and then push towards COMT and support COMT, right? Or we can push away from 1B1 with like COPS and citrus bioflavonoids. So that's the cool thing. That's the thing that you need to know, is you can manipulate those, right, with nutrition and diet. And then that's when you know that you've got it right. We've got good clearance and we've got efficacy, and you're feeling better, whether you're perimenopausal, menopausal, or postmenopausal.
perfect. So you do personalized medicine, as we do here at the DNA company, based on genetics and testing and all of those things. Do you have some some case studies or anything like that that you can share to make this feel for our audience like they can see themselves in one of your patients?
Sure. Let's see. So, let's see. The first one, I'm going to give an example of somebody that was undertreated, right? Just to give an idea, so why it's important to test. So we had a patient come in to see us, and she had been put on hormone replacement therapy by a well-meaning functional medicine doc, and she, really didn't have any major symptoms, right? And she was like, I'm not having hot flashes, night sweats, I don't have any vaginal dryness, like the easy stuff. And so she'd been on it for years. She'd had a DEXA, which is a bone mineral density test to look at risk for osteoporosis, about 8 years ago. So about when she saw that doctor, it looked good at the time. They never recommended getting another one. So she thought she was doing fine, and she was doing all the right things: eating plenty of protein, lifting weights, doing high intensity intervals, sleeping. She had her stuff dialed in, truly dialed in. When she came to see us, we got a DEXA and an Echolite, which looks a little deeper at the quality of the bone. And lo and behold, she was actually had osteoporosis, right? So then you look at that and you go, how, right? And she was eating right. She was getting plenty of dietary calcium, protein, and everything else. When we got her blood work back, her estradiol was 34, right? Which is below the threshold that most of the studies show that really improve the bone. So she had gone along for years assuming she was in this just right phase because she wasn't symptomatic, but she wasn't really protecting her bone. That's the stuff that to me is really important. I want you to metabolically be sound, but I also want to protect your brain, your heart, your bones. So on that end, you could have somebody that's being treated and maybe not treated appropriately because they were just going on symptoms alone and not really examining it. But let's talk about, so I have a really good example of a young woman who came to us via telemedicine. She was in her late 30s. She had always had really painful periods, like horribly painful periods. And she wanted off birth control because they did what everybody does. The doctors were like, here, let's look at, staying on this long term in case and maybe you want to have children. And she wanted to have, she wasn't sure if she wanted to have kids, but she thought she might. So obviously you can't test somebody while they're on birth control. Testing the hormones is really not valid because all you're testing is the hormone that they're taking. And so she got off the hormones, and her periods came back to normal timing, roughly, fairly quickly. Not everybody does, but her periods were horrible, horrible, painful, destructively painful. And I assumed immediately it was probably endometriosis, just because of the amount of abdominal bloating and pain all over. And about 5 days of, relief during the month when she was right at the end of her period. And, so one of the things that we looked at her genetics, but we also looked at her urinary metabolites. And she also had a very poor ability to clear these estrogens, right? So CYP1B1, CYP3A4 have some loose, and some other genes too, kind of further down that aren't necessarily always tested for, have some relationship with endometriosis and estrogen excess, fibroids, all of those things. So she had that. She had a lot of estrogen. And, we did what we could to kind of clean it up and improve the overall effect. And we got her pain down by half, right? By just supporting the detoxification and other stuff. She ended up having endometrial surgery because it was all over the place. So if you're not familiar with endometriosis, it's an endometrial tissue. It's the tissue from inside the uterine that gets outside of it, and it grows everywhere. The bladder, the bowels, the ovaries, it can just kind of take over. And every time our hormones shift, it gets activated, right? So as you cycle every month, it gets activated, brings blood supply and all these other things. So she ended up having endometrial surgery to get rid of it. But even just that, and she had a pretty bad case of it. I mean, it was everywhere. Even just supporting the detox pathways and clean eating and, doing all the things that we could do, removing xenoestrogens, which are the toxins in your environment, reduced her pain by half, right? Without taking extra pain medications and other things. So, you could look across that spectrum. When you look at these pathways and you support them properly, you can take things that are highly symptomatic and improve them, right? Sometimes it's not the panacea for everything, but we can definitely make major impact.
And someone getting a DNA 360 test gives them an idea of what they were born with,
Yep.
right? So they know what their tendencies are, and they can consult with someone who can tell them, this is your tendency. You probably want to do this, avoid this, things like that. And then they can do urine testing to see what's actually happening. And they can make sure that the interventions that they're being given are working, or if maybe they need to be dosed higher on those interventions or something like that. And so we're living in a time when we can actually have measurable um, testing done so that we can give people really accurate advice,
Yes.
and be very precise in it instead of kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping that something works. We have this testing that we can do, and I think that that's a really exciting time to be here. And
Mhm.
now there are even we have a different test, which is the breast 360, which I know you're
Yes.
also familiar with, which is a tier test, and it detects with 91% sensitivity early detection of proteins that show an inflammatory marker that's present in breast cancer. And why would someone want to do this test? Sometimes people are too young to be screened regularly using mammograms or other things. And some people live in underserved areas, and it can be harder to get a test. So if they take this test, then
Mhm.
they know, do I need to go get further testing? Because it's not diagnostic. It's an indicator, but it's something that can be done at home,
Yeah.
and it's non-invasive, and it can give people peace of mind, especially people who maybe their family has a history of breast cancer. They may
Yeah.
want to start testing earlier than is recommended by the usual standard of care. So I just get excited about all of the tools that we have at our disposal to use in our practices. Are there other lifestyle things, like how big of a deal, Dr. Murray,
Mhm.
do you think things like sleep and diet and the right amount of exercise, not too little, not too much, how much impact do you see that making in people's lives when it comes to this to hormone issues?
I'd say almost 50%. As somebody that tried to figure out how to bypass the sleep thing, because I was like, I'm a busy person. I like doing stuff. Like I never slept well. Right. And so I was always like, I'm going to find a nutritional way around this. Like, nope, you have to sleep like your life depends on it. The reality is poor sleep increases insulin resistance, cortisol's high when you're in perimenopause and menopause relative to everything else. You've got a cortisol excess problem. And your body cannot recover. It can't even clean out the junk in your brain if you don't give it enough hours to sleep. So I protect sleep like my life depends on it. And for a lot of women, that's where a huge percentage of the problems of menopause and perimenopause come up, because the loss of those hormones really messes with our ability to sleep. We wake up at 3 a.m., we're up for several hours, and we start to fall asleep at 5:45, and the alarm goes off at 6, and we're like, oh my God. And so to me, it's really, really important when we look at, like, if we're going back to that sort of metabolism conversation. um, what I see often, and I would say this was also my case, I was kind of over exercising because, of course, what does somebody do? I was in the bodybuilding world and I've been a triathlete before. So when my body started going haywire, I just doubled down. I was like, well, I'll just do more of it. I'll just keep doing more of it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't work. Um, but you can't not do it either, right? And so in some cases, we might be over exercising, and in other cases, we might be under exercising, but really dialing that in. And it's important to look at your genetics, at what your body's wired to do. I'm not wired for triathlons. I felt like crap when I did them. I didn't know my genetics at that point. I'm a sprinter, right? I'm a muscle power gene. I am not meant to do that. Um, so understanding that, but there are some things, particularly if I'm trying to get weight off, right? If I'm like, my metabolism has slowed to a crawl, I must lift weights because that is highly anabolic, right? I must lift weights. It also builds bone, but it's also a huge mitochondrial biogenesis muscle fiber builder. The other thing is I do need to do some cardio. The problem is most people do the wrong cardio, right? So I want to do sprints, right? Sprints are all out effort. Can't do it for longer than 30 seconds to a minute. So not 2 minute intervals. I'm talking ideally 20 seconds. Then you gas out, right? Because that stimulates in a whole other pathway. But one of the things that I think is super important is steady state zone 2 cardio, right? And most people that do this stuff, and so you can calculate it 220 minus your age at 80%. That's usually roughly where it is. So a woman in midlife is usually around 135, depending on her cardiovascular fitness. The problem is most people, if they run or cycle or do anything, they go too hard. They go above that range. And walking usually isn't enough to get you in that range. The reason why is we've got to get the muscle tissue of your big muscle groups, legs, butt, back, moving, because they're the ones that consume your fuel, right? They're going to consume glucose, and they're going to consume fat. And then when I sleep, I'm going to burn fat. So that's why sleeping is important. You don't burn fat while you're hanging out doing stuff, right? Most of fat burning happens at night. So we have to do that. And we can add hormones, and then we have to dial in the diet based on my genetics and then based on where I am in my hormone path to support the metabolism that might be going a little bit sideways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All of that. I remember.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I had done a triathlon, and I was also trying to go really hard uphill on my bike, and I went up this thing twice, and both times I got a migraine because that just wasn't, it was not the right thing for me to do.
I gained weight doing Olympic distance triathlons. I was like, how is this even possible? I was doing 2 days. I was like, man, I gained 10 pounds doing triathlons. How's that possible? Because I was so inflamed.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think the more is better is very much a mentality, or less food, more exercise, um, is something that is just so hammered into our brains that um, shifting that can take some time. So that's one of the reasons I like to bring it up on multiple webinars, is because sometimes we have to hear it a few times in order to believe it, right?
Well, we're scared of it, right? You're scared of it because you're like, when I've eaten more in the past, my weight has gone up, right? And here's the thing, I think it's really important for everybody here. Weight is not the problem. Your body weight is a symptom of the imbalance your body is in, right? Now, in some cases, it is somebody that's eating foods that are not health giving, but a lot of times it's your body thinks it's saving itself, and there's imbalances going on hormonally, metabolically, all kinds of things, inflammatory, and your body is holding on to it, and it's a side effect of what's going on. But we talk about it in the medical community and globally as it's a problem, and then we make it a morality problem and a willpower problem, which is all crap.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much. We have several questions in the Q&A, so I think that I want to transition
Yeah.
in there pretty quickly. Do you have anything else that you feel like you really need to say?
Yeah, I want to talk, just let me talk in broad strokes about dietary things if you're perimenopause and menopause. And and then I'm going to say, here's the area where you want to look at your genes, right? So a keto is not going to be good because of saturated fat, ApoA2, right? Right. And in many cases, that's not helpful. And in many cases, even if you don't have ApoA2, I wouldn't do keto. So if you're thinking keto, that's probably not it. Here's where the research resides, right? So one of the things that's the most powerful thing we can do for insulin resistance and improving visceral fat is fiber count, high fiber foods. And there is a difference between taking supplemental fiber and eating vegetables and fruits. I'm sorry, the research is out there. Like, it is different when you take a bunch of psyllium or whatever cellulose fiber and then you avoid the vegetables. There's just no way. You got to eat them, right? And so the goal, a minimum of 25. I actually have people shoot for 35. You don't start there, 35 grams, right? So you don't start there, because if you get bloating, if you've never eaten fiber, you'll get bloated. But you want to work towards that. Right. So what that does is when you eat it, it slows gastric emptying. It also wraps around the carbohydrate molecule, pulls it deeper into the gut, and gives it to your microbiome instead of you. Right. That's why dietary fiber is so important. It also changes the signaling. It increases short chain fatty acids, which helps mitochondrial function, which is also the food source for your microbes. And it also helps with all of the hormone signaling like GLP, GIP, all of those areas do change a little bit. So fiber is super, super important. Protein is also really, really important to muscle retention and muscle building. Here's an interesting caveat. I don't have good research on this. There's some, but we just have never dug into this because, of course, we don't look at women. If you've been somewhat sedentary and you have been, I eat protein like it's my lifestyle, right? Like I make sure, because I hear this, Betty, I get my protein, but I don't get my vegetables, right? Let's say you're eating 150 grams and you're not eating any carbs. You're like, I can't lose any weight. Your body can take that protein and turn it into glucose, gluconeogenesis, and that is estrogen dependent, right? So it gets amplified when we get into menopause. So in some cases, we might reduce that protein intake while we're ramping up your exercise, right? This is short term because we need to get your body to quit making glucose out of it, right? It's hard for us to test. It's not an easy thing to pick up in the blood. I've kind of sort of extrapolated it before, but it's not as easy. So we need protein, but if you're hitting protein like your life depends on it and you're gaining weight, it might be that your body's making sugar out of it because it can. The other thing is hydration, right? Rick Johnson, his team, he's 300 papers deep. They found two major things. If you're dehydrated, it slows your metabolism, right? If you're dehydrated, it decreases ATP production by signaling inside the powerhouse to produce AMPK. So it like screws up all of your powerhouse. The other really interesting thing they found is if the glucose that's circulating in your bloodstream gets converted to fructose through the fructokinase enzyme, and that gets metabolized differently in the liver, right? So in a dehydrated state, even your healthy, somewhat, carbohydrate restrictive diet may be actually causing a slowing mechanism of your ATP production, that's even a bigger conversation. And so I think those things get it amplified in women because also at this time period, we're usually working a billion hours a week, taking care of kids, parents, everybody, and there's no time for us, right? So we got to stay hydrated. So fiber, protein, fiber and fruits and vegetables, right? Legumes and nuts if you do those, grains if you do those. Protein, but not too much. Get the other ones just as much as the protein, and then make sure you're really well hydrated because all of those things will start changing the metabolic things, but you got to do the exercise part and drive that first because that'll make you more metabolically sound.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you wanted to talk about that. And Dr. Murray is going to be joining us a couple more times this month and is going to be one of our speakers at the end of the month at the She Summit. I think that this time you're doing a recorded
yes, I think so.
Session. We have twice as many speakers for all of you because we're doing some that are live and some that are recorded so that you can, mix and match so many different topics. So look for Dr. Murray in more of our webinars and at the She Summit. All right, let's dive into our questions. All right. So Anne is asking, could you please discuss the role and function of DHEA, testosterone, and pregnenolone? Thank you.
All right. All right. So pregnenolone is your parent hormone to all of the other hormones. So it is produced from cholesterol and it gets made into other hormones. It has its own actions. I would say most of those actions happen in the brain. Like there's good research for like cognition. So pregnenolone can go down and make progesterone and then continue down that pathway, but it also cuts across to make DHEA. And so DHEA is your rest and restore hormone. Its job is to counterbalance cortisol. So if you think about cortisol coming up to respond to stress, DHEA should kind of come up and sort of tamp it back down. Under good regulatory control, those two things happen really, really well. Under poor regulatory control, it may not. DHEA can go down and make testosterone, but it can also make androstenedione and a bunch of other androgen metabolites that are less powerful than testosterone. And then testosterone in both a man and a woman has a lot to do with the brain. So testosterone is very much a dopamine support hormone. It drives libido, it drives attention, focus. It also helps with muscle building. So it is anabolic, and all your androgens, DHEA, and all of them are anabolic. So they help build. So we see a steady decline of testosterone from our 20s onwards. So by the time you're like 40, 50, it's significantly lower than what it was in our 20s, but it doesn't fluctuate like menopause. And so we also see kind of if we're not working hard at it, we'll see a decline of muscle mass and then bone mass with it. So think of those as kind of your anabolic hormones. Women make about 4 times the amount of testosterone than they do estrogen at any given time. Men make significantly higher amounts, magnitude higher.
Thank you very much. All right, next we have we had to have a quick question in the chat, which was just for you to reiterate something because um somebody because Ashley's actually taking notes.
Okay.
You said to stay hydrated because if not, it decreases ATP. And what else? If you
Yeah.
can just repeat that really quickly.
Yeah. So when we're poorly hydrated, right, it decreases ATP production because it stimulates enzyme pathways that change the amount of ATP that's produced and another thing called AMPK through the triggering of mitochondrial uric acid. So uric acid is sort of the signaling molecule. The other thing that his team found is that when somebody was dehydrated in the bloodstream, there would be a conversion of glucose through the fructokinase enzyme into fructose as part of a protective mechanism from, eons, millions of years back that helped us survive an ice age. And this is all actually studying salt-sensitive hypertension is where they found it. He's got a really good book. He's got a newer one out, but the old book was called The Fat Switch. It's fascinating, fascinating. He's been published 300 times. He's prolific.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's serious business.
Yeah, it's serious business. He's a pretty cool dude.
So next we have a question from Roxana, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Will you be addressing hormone support and balance in women in their 60s and beyond, concerns around memory issues, dementia, Alzheimer's? Basically, part of what I'm extrapolating from this is there an age after which you should not start hormone replacement therapy? And, I think you and I probably both have opinions on this, but please go right ahead.
No, there's never an age that you should not consider it. Every woman deserves the right to look at hormone replacement therapy. There's a bunch of studies that have been done in the last few years that elucidated a lot of this. So here's what we do know. If you're more than about a decade out from menopause, specifically around cognition, what happens when we're in menopause, and it also happens when we're pregnant, our brain remaps itself. Like if anybody remember pregnancy brain, like you can't remember anything. Your brain actually during pregnancy remaps from the prefrontal cortex back to the amygdala. So you'll remember to fight and flee with your baby. It's literally, it does that. We've seen it on MRIs. Now, when we go through menopause, what happens is the brain shrinks a little bit because we have massive amount of receptors for estrogen. And as the brain goes through menopause, we produce more receptors, right? So it's very, very important. And so estrogen blocks that remodeling process. So if I don't have it, because I was told I wasn't allowed to have it, what happens is the brain shrinks a little bit, and some of the superhighways that it sends to the prefrontal cortex remap over about a decade back to creative centers, right? So some of the memory and cognition stuff that we feel is because the brain literally remapped itself. What we know today is if somebody is like a decade out and some of that remapping has happened, it's already happened. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't put estrogen and progesterone and testosterone in to support the brain in other ways like mood, anxiety, or in the bones or in the heart. We just don't have good data on when you introduce it later, what happens. One of the things that we are also worried about is oral Premarin, right, which is horse pee, right? 13 different estrogens. And Prempro, never ever take that. If somebody tries to hand that to you, you just karate chop them in the head and run away. Never take that. The synthetic progestin, it causes clotting in anybody, right? It's just not a good choice. And that's the thing that has been associated with all the risk is the synthetic progestin. So when you give bioidentical estradiol or Biest, you give it topically, a patch of cream and oil and a pellet. It never goes in the mouth and gets swallowed, right? It carries, there's a 10 million women study paid for by Medicare and actually it was listed in Menopause Society Journal. 10 million women, they looked at all-cause mortality over the course of like 2006 to 2021. Taking hormones, never stopping them or taking them at some point, reduce the risk of dying in all causes. right? And in this study, this was the first big study where they had a big chunk of women that were on bioidentical topical forms in older age, because all of these women were 65 and above that they looked at. And they found that there was zero increased risk for stroke and heart attack, which is why we would worry about it with dementia, vascular disease in the brain in older women. So that really opens the door. So I think you should consider it, and I've had people, even though we know from kind of imaging that maybe the brain has remapped itself, I can tell you, we have women, because my clinic's been around for 20 years. We've been providing hormone replacement for 20 years. I have women, several, that we put on hormones in their 60s that are in their 80s and they're still rocking and rolling. And they're like, no, don't even try and take it. I'm like, not going to do it. Not going to do it. They're playing tennis, they're playing pickleball, they're sharp, real sharp. So we just can't say the research shows that.
Perfect. Thank you. Katie's asking, do you think that the estrogen receptors at the breast release microplastic as hormones and therefore are overexpressed? I'm wondering if
or that microplastics act as a xenoestrogen.
I think that's what's being said.
Yeah, I would say so we have two different estrogen receptors. We have estrogen receptor A and estrogen receptor B. B is cancer protective. Estrogen receptor A can be, if overstimulated, estrogen negative, like cancer producing. Estradiol sits on both, but predominantly hits B. Estriol hits B. Estrone hits A more heavily. Your xenoestrogens and your plastics and things like that likely hit estrogen receptor A. And I would bet microplastics, so all plasticizers, BPA is one of many chemical compounds used in plastic that is estrogenic. And to be honest, all of them have it. Plastic is plastic. All of them have estrogenic compounds. They just change the name and wait until we figure it out and then come up with a new compound. So my bet is that what we don't know is is that plastic compound binding irreversibly? Like birth control pills bind irreversibly to the estrogen receptor. That's why they make sure that you can't get pregnant, particularly on the ovaries. But we don't know, how long does BPA sit on there? How long does microplastics sit on there? We don't have the research yet. But my bet is that it acts as a xenoestrogen and probably binds to receptors.
Margaret is asking, how do you know an estradiol is too high, aside from tender breasts, when on MHT? Also, why do many hormone experts say the Dutch test is useless and not well studied?
Oh, that's good. So, I'm actually trying to create a test that's got a little more data on it. So every test has its caveats. I will say that. So, so what was the first part of the question? So Dutch test, and then
that was
breast tenderness. Yeah, breast tenderness. So, so you could get breast tenderness with progesterone excess and estrogen excess, and or the relative relationship between those can be at a balance, right? We can get that. We can get kind of swelling. If progesterone is low, you can also get things like spotting. We prefer to test, never guess. So at a minimum, we're going to look at someone's blood labs to make sure they're in range, but not above the range, right? Because we're already getting blood work to look at thyroid and other stuff. So we look at blood work. And then the other question is, if it looks normal in blood work, then we look at urinary hormones. We can do the Dutch test. We can do a 24-hour, which has been around for a long time, which looks at the total hormone production. That would tell you if it's too high or not. So we prefer labs to identify that, because again, what we don't know is if we were to line up 100 women and look at each one of them, we all look radically different. And a lot of that is due to our hormones. So we don't know what your normal was when you were 25, right? I can tell you for sure mine was real high, because when I did finally get around to testing it, I had very high estrogen, and I exploded all directions. I'm very curvy, right? I'm a curvy girl. It's obvious that I had a lot of estrogen, right? So some of it is we don't know what your normal was, right? So we're kind of trying to get there, and we use symptoms and labs to get you there. And then a lot of doctors don't know, because you got to understand that most doctors that are practicing right now were practicing during the Women's Health Initiative. They were never trained hormone replacement. Even gynecologists, less than 20% get an hour of menopause training, right? So you're working with a medical group that have no training. The other thing is if you look at the big societies that teach it, like Menopause Society, they don't even tell you to test. They're like, if your vasomotor symptoms, vaginal dryness, hot flashes, night sweats are okay, then you're fine. Who cares, right? Because that's their stance, their conventional stance. And so they would look at these other tests and say, we don't need those, right? Well, what I can tell you is the functional medicine community, we take care of the outliers. I'm an outlier. I was diagnosed with autoimmune conditions. I had horrible hormone problems. So when conventional medicine fails people, this is how they come to functional medicine. Now that's changing. The world is changing, but 20 years ago. And so we were forced to dig deeper to understand why somebody didn't fit the norms, right? Which is 30% of the population at least, right? And so a lot of those doctors never dig in and try and understand these genetic pathways or the urinary pathways and understand the value. This is literally why we're trying to bring our platform and research to market. I went to the Menopause Society president and told her what we were building. I was like, we're going to check hormone metabolites. We're going to look at it because I want to look at that for cancer and all these other things. And I said, and she said, well, we only believe, I'm going to do it the way she did. We only believe in evidence-based medicine. And I was like, well, that's interesting. I earned a PhD looking at evidence. Okay. And she goes, well, we only do, controlled trials. And I was like, so you mean to tell me you won't look at the hormone metabolism pathway until a drug manufacturer makes a drug that goes through that pathway that messes up the pathway to then check the urine to then figure out if it's damaging, even though you and I both know that that's an area of intense research for cancer, right? Understanding this. And she said, we're not going to look at it. And I was like, okay, so we'll wait 20 years, let the millennials and the Gen X suffer while we figure that out. And I was like, well, that now I know I don't have a relationship, right? So the reality is we have to push the envelope and test for it, capture data, and then understand it, because that helps us also make these tests better. But I would say it's because the doctors don't understand the value of and looking at how you get rid of it.
Perfect.
Sorry, that's a soapbox for me, as you can tell.
No, I think that that's information that we all wanted to know. So
Yeah.
I'm going to speak for myself and the audience.
Yeah.
So you've gone through, Roxana has another question about about testing. And I think you already kind of went over blood and urine, but you didn't say when there would be a case for using saliva if there is one. So
yeah, years ago, especially before we had readily available urinary testing, saliva tests free. However, you can get really wildly abnormal levels depending on how you deliver your hormones, right? So it can falsely show things higher than it is, particularly when using topical and micronized progesterone and topical estrogens. I don't use it that much. My preference is to use the urine and the blood. And I use blood because that's where the research is, right? We have to go back to, how do I know I'm protecting the brain, the heart, the bones? I gotta make sure that I'm hitting those researched pathways. So we don't use it very much, but a lot of people still do.
perfect. So Claudia is asking a question about leaky gut starting in menopause. And we can't advise you to take anything or not take anything because we're not your practitioners, but we could be if you wanted us to be. But she's wondering what you think in general about zinc carnosine for leaky gut, if you have an opinion.
Yeah, so zinc carnosine, I'll explain the mechanism in which it works. So zinc carnosine binds to the lining of the esophagus and the gastric body to protect it and support it from a repair standpoint, right? So we use it in things like heartburn, GERD, gastritis. It's often in products that may contain other things like glutamine and I'm trying to think of all the little herbs that are helpful for the stomach. Slippery elm, all those things. Like, it's often in combination for like gut things. It's more qualified for like upper GI. So GERD, heartburn, gastritis. If you're working on the lower GI tract, I would say there's other things that probably work a little bit better.
Perfect. Deborah is asking, if you have GSTT1, GSTM1 null genotypes and
Mhm.
have to take oh boy,
Yeah.
nor
Norethindrosterone.
yes, which for is a synthetic progesterone. That I can say.
Yeah.
For abnormal, excessive, and prolonged bleeding in late stage perimenopause, are there things you should be concerned about relative to detox and liver function? For example, could it explain high liver enzymes?
Off the top of my head, I'd have to look at how that's metabolized. I would bet that it is metabolized most heavily through the liver. I just can't off the top of my head quote that. If you didn't have high liver enzymes before and you have it after starting it, that's a good idea to look at and see. Um, you know, Trying to think because especially the CYP3A4 pathway is pretty persnickety if it gets overly stimulated to raise liver enzymes, particularly ALT. So if you see that out of nowhere and you've never had that before, that'd be worth looking at, especially if it correlates to when you introduce that. Adding some liver support if it's mildly elevated, like can sometimes help. If it's significantly elevated, that's something to talk to your doctor about. That you may need to change the mechanism or method or type that you're taking.
Do you see a difference in your practice with how people's genetics interact with bioidenticals versus um, synthetic hormones? Like, have you seen a lot of people that have certain genotypes in your practice that then they switch to something else and respond differently?
We don't have that many that are on synthetic. We predominantly get women that are in sort of the perimenopause transition or they're no longer on them. Um, and so the bioidenticals don't usually heavily burden the pathways. The synthetic ones may. It's been a long time since I've really looked at somebody that's been on like a birth control. And the other part of it is a lot of times we're not going to look at the Dutch test or a 24-hour urine or anything like that if they're on them, because we're getting falsified data. We can't really tell. But if I thought that was going on, that might be the avenue to check just to see. Um, but so many things, particularly so many drugs pass through that pathway, particularly at CY3A4.
Yeah. Yep. It's huge for that. All
Yeah.
right. Sheila is asking, I am genetically hormonally codominant. I'm 46 and still cycling monthly, but my flow varies. I want to get a Dutch test to get a baseline, but I'm unsure when during the month I should actually do the collection.
Yeah. So it's super easy when you're menopausal, anytime. But don't bother doing the Dutch test unless you have hormones on board. If you're menopausal, don't bother. It won't even be accurate. It'll tell you it's not accurate. You have to have enough in there. Now, if you're cycling, so what we generally want to see, and this will be true of blood work, is we want to see the second half of your cycle after you ovulate. Usually that's somewhere between day 19, 20, 21, if your cycle's roughly 28 days-ish. Right. And the reason why is we want to see the relative relationship between progesterone and estrogen. Right. If we check it before you ovulate, they're both going to be incredibly low. But the second half is when they both peak. And that's where we'll see, because often when you're 46, estrogen's here and progesterone's here.
And if things are fluctuating wildly, like one month you have a 21-day cycle, the next month you have a 40-day cycle, and you just have no idea how or when to test, you can do Mira testing, which can help you know when to do the Dutch test. So it's a different urine test that you do more days out of the month. It gives you more data points, and it can let you know the better time in the month to do the Dutch test.
Yeah, it's like a glucose monitor that you pee on a little strip and shove it in there. So it was designed for fertility, but it's amazing for perimenopause because you can check it all the time, once you have it.
Absolutely. Yeah, in some cases you may not need the Dutch test except for the fact that it does the metabolism pathways, right? So that would be the time, that would be the information that you would get from the Dutch and not from Mira.
Yeah.
But Mira will give you information that you don't get on the Dutch. So
Yeah.
it's
Like,
about your practitioner can recommend which is the right move for you. Okay, Jolene is saying, I've been on HRT for 2 months and just learning I have suboptimal methylation genes. How many months would you suggest to retest Dutch?
so what I would say first is we want to make sure that you are probably titrated or like moved your dose up to what we think is a therapeutic level, right? So symptom improvement, that kind of thing. Because if you're on the like very, very first, like lowest possible dose, then it's probably not going to be very much. You need to go up, right? Because the lowest dose is rarely ever, where people study. So I would say make sure you're kind of at that therapeutic dose, and that you've been on it for a while, a month or two, and then test it, and then really see. The most important part with urinary hormones is that you have enough to test, because they're sticky. Hormones are kind of sticky, and then you have to use a particular way to sort of break them apart, so they sort of break apart the hormone from its sort of carrier. Remember that thing I was talking about wrapping around it? They break them loose to look at it. And when they're incredibly low, it just makes it hard for them to pick up like the fidelity of it. And so that's why I'm like, you want to make sure that your values are there. If the test was free and insurance covered it, I'd be like, who cares? But it's expensive. So we want to make sure that we get valid data.
Yes, yes. So Madeline is asking how our DNA testing is different from the Dutch test in terms of reliability if epigenetics are the most determining factor. And so the our DNA test tests what you were born with, and what the Dutch test is saying how it's actually going that day, right?
Yeah.
So it's perfect for if you do an intervention. So if you look at our the DNA 360, and it shows that you have suboptimal pathways, a couple of them, and we advise you to change your diet, add this supplement, do this thing. Then if you take a Dutch test, you can see how it's actually working and whether or not you need to up the dose of the supplement or whether it's working perfectly, all of those things. It's sort of what's happening right now, not what you were born with, but what's happening today. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, let me share my screen for just 2 seconds, because you guys saw my genetics, right? I just happen to have my Dutch test open on another window. All right, so I'm going to show you this real quickly. So you saw I cannot clear estrogen very well, right? Genetically, right? This is my Dutch test. Let's see if I can make that. Let me make it a little smaller so you can see it. This is my Dutch test while on hormones, right? I was on quite a bit of testosterone. We had to take that down a little bit. It's a little too high. But my progesterone, you can see my progesterone is good. My estradiol is a hockey stick. It's going the same direction. My CYP3A4, I'm slow in. CYP1B1, moderately high in genetically. CYP3A40, but you can see my distribution here is good, right? My methylation was high, right? So even though I wasn't good genetically, my Dutch test or my, hormone zoomer, there's a bunch of companies that make these, shows it in action. So this shows me that day doing what I was doing. Am I good, right? Did I correct for my genetic propensity?
Which you did.
I did. And I check my, urinary hormones about once a year just to make sure that I haven't like lost the effect I needed.
That's right. It's good to monitor these things. So Anne is asking that you mentioned ApoE. Do you mean ApoE4 for saturated fats, not ApoE2? But what you said was ApoA2.
Yeah.
And if you have GG for that particular gene, then then saturated fat is not the ideal situation for you. Now, that's not to say that ApoE3 and 4 are not part of this picture, but I just wanted to say that it was ApoA2, not E2.
Yeah, and that's in your diet and lifestyle part of the DNA test, right? With like Amy 1 talking about starches, that's the one that talks about saturated fats. And if you're a menopausal woman with mutations there and you are hitting the MCT and coconut, you're probably going to see a high lipid panel. Just saying.
Yep.
It's going to go.
I see that frequently, actually.
Yeah.
Because people are trying to keep their
yeah.
carbs low. And so sometimes what they compensate with, sometimes you can't have really too much of either one. So
Nope.
I'm one of those people.
I got both. I'm doubly mutated on Amy and ApoA2. So I'm like, no, I can do air.
You and I maybe were related. All right. So Emily's asking, is there any correlation between estrogen and high cholesterol? And if so, can you talk about statins' impact on women and hormones?
Oh, yes. So it is well documented. Right. We got to remember that our cholesterol is made by our liver, and our liver has estrogen receptors. And so what we see is a steady increase in cholesterol in women as they go through perimenopause and menopause. I think the current stats are about a 19% increase on average in cholesterol levels. So a lot of us were fine. Then all of a sudden the doctor's like, you need a statin, right? And it's because the liver is making it. It's not dietary. Although taking estrogen doesn't necessarily lower it a lot, we'll see it come down a little bit, but it doesn't always pull it out of that range. The research on statins, generally, there's a couple that indicate maybe potential use, but overall, it is not favorable for women. It doesn't provide primary prevention of a heart attack. Now, what's interesting is it may in somebody that already had it, but 50% of women will not survive the first one. Right. So statin medications are overwhelmingly kind of not great. And the other part is they affect your ability to make CoQ10. They're mitochondrial damaging drugs. And so many people get muscle weakness, pain, other things. I think there's other better ways to address the cholesterol. So first, looking at dietary intake, reducing saturated fats, because your body can at least reduce what you're absorbing from your diet. If you're a carrier of ApoA2, you're going to hyperabsorb saturated fat. So you want to stay away from butters, coconut oil, MCT. Add fiber, because fiber binds to it in the gut. If all of those things aren't working and your doctor's really pressing you, there's ezetimibe, otherwise known as Zetia, that works in the gut and keeps you from absorbing dietary cholesterol. It does not affect that enzyme that affects mitochondrial function. It can work, but if you have CYP3A4 problems, it probably might raise your liver enzymes. So if you get on it, check it. I tried it, made my liver enzymes go up. Because I take one for the team, because I'm always curious what will happen. And I was like, let's see, I'm doubly mutated there. Let's see. And I was like, oh yeah, ALT went really high. Yeah, there you go. So if you can, you want to avoid that. There is, from a medication standpoint, probably the game-changing drug is a PCSK9 inhibitor, which is on the DNA 360. That drug, Repatha, is a game changer. That one, but you have to fight for that. And if somebody has really bad, like familial hypercholesterolemia or something like that, or ApoA2, that one is a game changer. Or I'm sorry, apolipoprotein.
Little a.
And then apolipoprotein B high. Those are going to be the two things that may help it.
Yeah. And we didn't mention this, but on your DNA 360, if you look at your SLCO1B1, that also will show you, your own personal status in terms of risk benefit analysis for statins. But interestingly, Dr. Murray, I also, as I was looking through studies, that gene also, it shows, has an impact on night sweats. And I had no idea that was a thing. So I just thought I would share that little tidbit with you because we like to talk about new and interesting things. Okay, we have our final question. Oh, did you know that?
No, I didn't know that, but I was going to say some people get the muscle weakness from statins even without that mutation. If you carry that mutation, you can get permanent damage.
So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. If you stay on it and it keeps going. Yeah.
Fabiola is asking, what is DIM good for? I'm going through menopause and looking for something to help with severe hot flashes.
All right. So DIM helps push your estradiol down the 2-hydroxy pathway, right? So it helps that first stage CYP enzyme move. Here's where it gets, at least this is my opinion. You might differ, Dr. Hardcastle, but when you're in the menopausal transition, often what's happening is your estradiol may be low relative to what it was before. Estrone may be high relative to it. This is where testing can come in. If you take a ton of DIM, you are going to lower estradiol. And if you're on bioidentical hormone replacement, you do not want to take truckloads of DIM because you are just going to pee it out. It's going to reduce it. So this is where you might want to use other ingredients, things like hops, citrus bioflavonoids, chrysin, green tea extracts, or other things that can sort of move the detox pathways. And so I would look for a combination product that had a little bit of all those things and not just DIM, because what you might be doing is making your hot flashes and stuff worse by actually lowering your estrogen more.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. and even the combination of NAC and resveratrol.
Yep.
Not that I'm recommending this to anyone specifically, just to be clear, but that is another way of doing it that doesn't lower the estradiol directly. Instead is all about conversion. So,
Yep.
Dr. Murray, a pleasure as always. Do you have any parting words for our wonderful audience this evening?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest one is use your DNA to help inform what you do every day, not to be fearful of it. Not to think I got, I mean, I joke around and say I got screwed or whatever, but the reality is I didn't. My ancestors made it here because of those things happening. And you have to work with it, not against it.
Yep. Self-acceptance and
Yep.
Embracing those gifts. Thank you all very much, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.